Mena-Watch, the independent Middle East think tank. Let's take another look at the situation in the vicinity of Israel. So, during the recent attack launched from Iran, Jordan and Saudi Arabia actually supported Israel's defense efforts. And Hezbollah was urged by the Lebanese government not to get involved, which it hasn't. It's probably too weakened to really be much of a threat anyway. So, how would you evaluate the current situation where these nations are siding with Israel? Is that a fair assumption to make?
That depends on what exactly you mean by on Israel's side, and also these are also different constellations of circumstances. Fortunately, in Lebanon, we are now seeing a development where the situation I mentioned earlier regarding the 1980s and beyond, when Hezbollah had de facto taken power in Lebanon, no longer exists. This represents a significant shift. Even before October 7th, 2023, Hezbollah, alongside the Iranian regime, was already considered the most perilous and formidable conventional military threat confronting Israel's security and sovereignty. There were well over 100,000 Hezbollah rockets aimed at Israel. And it was only through this particular war, which was, in contrast to the Gaza war, highly successful, that Israel was reluctantly compelled to wage against Hezbollah, that this specific threat was finally neutralized. And domestically within Lebanon, this development has also led to a situation where, for the first time in a very long time, the non-Hezbollah forces, essentially the de facto state institutions and powers, are actually daring to clearly position themselves against Hezbollah. They are attempting to eventually achieve its complete disarmament and set things right in the long run. This was only made possible because Israel had already done the heavy lifting beforehand, effectively neutralizing the leadership and destroying a significant portion of that rocket arsenal, or at the very least, rendering them incapable of being launched at present. The Iranian regime had unequivocally established Hezbollah, specifically with the intent for it to serve as a formidable front, rising against Israel in precisely this kind of current situation. And that's not happening right now. That's one of the really positive developments at the moment. Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Jordan has had a peace treaty since 1994. So, as part of Yitzhak Rabin's conceptual framework, a second Arab nation established a peace agreement with Israel. However, one must admit it's certainly not what you'd call a particularly warm peace, wouldn't you agree? So, like the old Cold War era peace with Egypt and Jordan, it's been a cold peace, you could say, one that doesn't focus much on societal exchange. However, regarding security policy, there exists robust cooperation, which conspicuously manifested during the interception of these rocket attacks. This isn't merely confined to the present circumstances, as there have already been 2 prior direct ballistic missile assaults on Israel originating from Iran. And indeed, those were largely intercepted with significant assistance from a number of Arab states demonstrating effective collaborative efforts. Currently, that probably won't work completely due to the sheer volume. We're actually starting to see some of that now. However, with Saudi Arabia, the situation is much more intricate, wouldn't you agree? They haven't signed a peace treaty with Israel yet, but Saudi Arabia was on the verge of having a peace treaty with Israel. This was also an aim of the October 7th attack. Shortly before October 7th, Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler, publicly stated for the first time, "We are engaging in peace negotiations with Israel." Anyone who was paying attention already knew about the close contacts and discussions, but that was the first time he sat in an American TV studio and publicly confirmed it. And he also said, yes, it's progressing well. October 7th was directed against that, yes. So Hamas, acting as a front organization for the Iranian regime, wanted to torpedo exactly this rapprochement because they have to prevent it. This, in fact, runs completely counter to their overall strategy. They actually succeeded in getting these peace negotiations completely put on hold, didn't they? So that's the official Saudi phrasing, but they are not off the table. Saudi Arabia has indeed made it explicitly clear that once the conflict against Hamas in the Gaza Strip eventually concludes, and Saudi Arabia undoubtedly desires an outcome similar to Israel's, specifically the complete eradication of Hamas as a military force. Once that has taken place, they intend to restart peace negotiations with Israel. So is that then considered to be within the framework of the Abraham Accords, which currently includes, well, the United Arab Emirates and then also Morocco, Bahrain and Oman as well? No, not Oman yet. Not yet. But are they in the starting blocks? Yes. Middle East experts, both inside and outside the region, like to play Abraham Accords bingo and guess, well, who's next to join? Oman's always mentioned, of course, but they're not in yet. Yeah. And Sudan? Sudan is quite a complex situation. Officially, Sudan has indeed joined, but due to its internal political developments, or more accurately, the catastrophe unfolding there, it's not really playing a significant role right now. When one speaks of the Abraham Accords today, it refers to those agreements that were concluded in 2020, initially by the United Arab Emirates, then Bahrain, and subsequently a bit later, I believe, in 2021 by Morocco. So those are the three key countries in question. And within that framework, the consistent message was that this process should indeed continue, which prompted Saudi Arabia to also establish these contacts. I also believe that the treaties, those that were actually signed back in 2020, already had a significant connection and much to do with Saudi Arabia, influencing their geopolitical strategies. So the United Arab Emirates, they did it more or less independently, though presumably in coordination with Saudi Arabia. And I truly believe that is the most crucial agreement of all, precisely because the United Arab Emirates is just such an eminently significant nation. Bahrain. Now, I don't mean to offend the Bahrainis, but politically speaking, in Bahrain, practically nothing gets done without Riyadh's explicit approval. So, in a way, Bahrain was also a kind of trial balloon for the Saudis. They said, let's have the small, not particularly important Bahrain do it first. If that goes well, then we'll push it forward too. And that's exactly what they did. Then they said, it's going well. What about Qatar? Well, they don't play a role in this constellation at all. Quite the opposite, in fact. While they are not as definitively aligned with the Iranian regime as, say, Hezbollah, Assad, or even Hamas and Islamic Jihad, they still tend to lean in that direction. And so they strategically rely on, they pursue an intermediate strategy, aiming to position themselves strategically among all parties. Simultaneously, they're a vital ally for the US due to purely military strategic considerations. That's one reason they get away with so much. But I'd like to go back. So they're definitely not part of these Abraham Accords, and I would venture to guess, even though I've already mentioned my reservations about making predictions, I certainly wouldn't presume that Qatar would be among the very next states to align themselves with these Abraham Accords. So there are other candidates. Oman has already been mentioned. Some non-Arab countries also come into play here. A very important one among them is Indonesia, right? Indonesia is a huge country. This is quite new to mention. It actually boasts the largest Muslim population in the entire world, making it the most populous Muslim nation. An eminently important player, both economically and militarily. Yes, and there are already discussion formats in place there. And another critical point for the regional security architecture concerns these Abraham Accords, which are already established, particularly with the United Arab Emirates, but also including Morocco and Bahrain. They facilitate various additional formats, with a prime example being the I2U2 group. The two I's in this instance refer to Israel and India, while the two U's stand for the United States of America and the United Arab Emirates. This means that those who were instrumental in advancing the Abraham Accords are trying to bring another extremely important regional power, namely India, into this process. And then we have the I2U2 plus group. Saudi Arabia is already integrated into the whole thing through that. So the plus in this case are Egypt and Jordan, which already have peace treaties, and Saudi Arabia. Once more, Saudi Arabia is indeed the pivotal player for the future, standing out as by far the most significant, largest, and dominant nation within this current arrangement. If Saudi Arabia were to eventually join these Abraham Accords, it would genuinely be a significant game changer, fundamentally reshaping the entire dynamic of the Middle East. That's another reason why the Iranian Axis, the actors of October 7th, had to prevent exactly that at all costs. Now, let's turn our attention once again to the relationship between Germany and Israel. During the election campaign, Chancellor Merz had consistently presented himself in such a way that he came across as strongly pro-Israel. However, that perspective has indeed shifted somewhat, and there have been explicit remarks suggesting that the actions taken by the IDF in Gaza are indeed disproportionate. How would you assess this current situation? What kind of role has Germany taken on regarding Israel, especially in the wake of recent events? And in your opinion, how do you envision this situation continuing to unfold in the future? Will it be the case when Iran withdraws from the agreement? Thus, the current focal point is undoubtedly Gaza, and what's particularly noteworthy is the relentless and frankly astounding propaganda narrative that emanates from Arab or pro-Arab journalists within that region, ultimately reaching our screens here on Western television, shaping public perception. If that's currently losing a bit of its focus, could it be that this might somewhat foster and truly enhance the relationship between Israel and Germany once more? Or is there perhaps no significant prospect whatsoever for any real improvement in the situation? So, one point, maybe just regarding the wording. I wouldn't say pro-Arab journalists, because there are very many Arab journalists who strongly criticize this propaganda show by Hamas. So they are, but not on German television, well, exactly because they don't get invited. But that is certainly one of the problems. One could also say the same regarding the Palestinians. There are indeed Palestinian refugees living right here in Germany who fled from Hamas. And the real question is, why aren't they being interviewed from morning till night? Because they really have something to say about the situation in the Gaza Strip. But those just aren't the voices people want to hear. It doesn't quite fit this picture that there's some kind of natural force at work. All Arabs, all Palestinians hate Israel. Luckily, that's not the case, and that should be made clear. That would be one of them who, by the way, is currently threatened with deportation, which is completely and utterly insane. Anyway, but the question was actually about the German-Israeli relationship. In many respects, well, maybe let's put it this way, I'm not particularly surprised by the statements now coming from CDU politicians. I see them as part of a continuity in German foreign policy, domestic policy, and policy towards Israel. It was never particularly straightforward or simple. Rather, it unfolds within a very specific setting. And this setting is, quite logically, exceptionally unique, because we are discussing the relationship between the successor state to National Socialism and the nation of Shoah survivors and their descendants. It's truly impossible to have a more uniquely specific relationship between two states than that. And that has been the fundamental prerequisite guiding every German federal government's foreign policy throughout recent decades. And there are specific contexts, among them this now ubiquitous phrase only in use since roughly 2008, that Israel's security is integral to Germany's reason of state. Yet, especially when viewed against the German-Iran policy, this is truly nothing more than an empty platitude, meaning nothing really. On the contrary, the Iran policy of every German federal government completely undermines this assertion that Israel's security is an integral part of Germany's reason of state, and this applies not only to that, but extends even further. I wouldn't find it particularly unusual, considering the methods of warfare being employed in the Gaza Strip, especially. After criticism within Israel itself became significantly more intense than it had been during the initial 20 months. During that earlier period, the broadest segments of Israeli society and its political landscape had very actively supported this ongoing warfare against Hamas and other militant groups. This has also notably shifted in Israel, as we are aware. There's a growing accusation, and I'm not here to judge its veracity, but it's becoming increasingly strong, that this is driven by Netanyahu's personal agendas. It's perceived as no longer making sense, militarily or otherwise, and that the focus on the hostages is diminishing. But that's a very different debate from the one we're having in Germany. So, in my view, this is a very necessary internal Israeli discussion that simply must take place. And I don't know how it will turn out, nor do I want to judge it. What you hear from German politicians are, well, typical German statements, because they don't simply say, at this precise point, we believe we should now be critical of a particular military action. Instead, suddenly, individuals who were seen as pro-Israel during the election campaign are now expressing views that leave one pondering the true meaning of their words within the German context. That makes one ask, what does that mean in Germany? They often speak of compulsory solidarity, you see, and there are numerous other terms and phrases that instantly reveal that it's not truly about the concrete situation in the Middle East at all, neither in the public discourse surrounding Iran and Israel in Germany, nor in these political statements. Instead, it is, as always, ultimately and entirely about Germany itself. It's about their own stances expressed in the feuilleton, their own personal sensitivities and feelings. It's about the projections they have onto Israel, onto the conflict, and also onto Israel's enemies. And you can truly notice that in the phrasing they opt for. It's clear they really struggle to break free from this rather rigid template, which is extensively shaped by that initial. constellation I described, that of the successor state to National Socialism and the state of Holocaust survivors, it's like they can't break free from it or finally draw the proper conclusions from this situation.
That really is the core question. What is it that Germany can actually do to support Israel? So, the discussion frequently revolves around arms deliveries, as if it were a negotiation, with verbal affirmations or rejections. What Germany actually supplies in terms of weapons is such a marginal issue. Primarily, it would primarily consist of spare parts that are delivered or possibly even additional equipment. So, yes, I sometimes wonder, how can this really be such a significant topic when Germany's actual impact is so negligible?
Well, I'm actually not entirely convinced that it's completely insignificant, and that applies to both sides of the issue. Well, if you consider this again from a historical perspective spanning all these decades, you'll find a striking simultaneity of various events. On one hand, we've consistently heard very overt, even anti-Israeli statements from various German federal governments, even reaching as far as Angela Merkel's tenure, haven't we? For example, under Helmut Schmidt, during Willy Brandt's time, urgently needed arms deliveries were halted during the Yom Kippur War. It wasn't merely about statements, there was concrete, truly anti-Israeli policy. And under Kohl, things didn't really get any better, especially in terms of rhetoric, you know. Of course, he grumbled about the interference of the World Jewish Congress and so on. And yet, at the same time, a very close network of relationships has developed between the two states, societies and nations, on the level of scientific advancement, on the economic front, and also within the scope of military and security cooperation. So I wouldn't minimize the significance of that too much. The role that it plays. And arms deliveries, in a sense, also go in both directions. And in my opinion, that really does play a significant role. Well, if you were to ask me for my assessment or how I politically evaluate this situation, it should undoubtedly be completely beyond any dispute. Of course, Germany should supply Israel with every conceivable weapon, enabling Israel to effectively defend itself against its mortal enemies. That's absolutely clear. That should absolutely be taken for granted. But also on the question of, yes, how can Germany effectively support Israel? I come back to the Iran policy, not just because it's a pet topic of mine, but because it's one of the central points. Because in no other area is it so glaringly obvious how deceptive it truly is when they constantly assert, yes, we are the most important or second most important supporters of Israel right after the US. Looking at Iran policy, one must say, no, that's entirely false. You're the key supporters of Israel's mortal enemies.
Yes, and the question also arises because Iran very strongly supports Gaza and Hamas, meaning this terror within their own territory of Gaza. If the regime were to collapse, would that also mean that the Gaza problem is taken care of, making it possible for us to assume that to be the case?
The question is what taken care of truly signifies. There are naturally other sponsors and backers of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and various groups, and Fatah too is not without its own complexities. But it would be a major change if the previous main sponsor of Hamas, Islamic Jihad and so on, were to disappear, and that is the Iranian regime. Therefore, it's clear, yes, that this was indeed the active policy of the Iranian regime over the past 2 decades. This policy specifically empowered Hamas, and more precisely Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, to execute those devastating attacks on October 7th. You can distinctly trace that back. I mean, we even have knowledge of Sinwar's visits to Tehran, where it was most assuredly decided, not in minute detail perhaps, but certainly that they intended to commit to this sort of action. Sinwar then spent several more years meticulously planning and preparing to strike. However, the Iranian regime was likely not even privy to the precise timing of the attack. There was a brief period of tension that arose between them. Hezbollah felt quite offended since that was in fact their original plan, you see. They actually wanted to carry out a kind of infiltration of northern Israel. And that's exactly what Israel was expecting, and Sinwar basically stole that plan away. He was able to carry it out solely with the full backing of Iran, yes.
So I'm really not sure how much this actually reflects your findings and your deep understanding of the situation within the Gaza Strip. Who genuinely still holds the power, to truly come to any kind of agreement with Israel at all? This is because all of the top high-ranking leaders have been completely eliminated. Who still holds the hostages in their power now? Who could possibly strike an agreement with Israel? I genuinely don't understand how that could happen.
Yes, because unfortunately Hamas still maintains its structures, while Hamas has indeed been shattered as a military force.
Okay.
No, on October 7th, that wasn't merely a terror group, it was truly a terror army. That was precisely the problem, that it was permitted for them to evolve from what were essentially a few lunatic terror groups, dangerous though they may be, but, hardly representing a military threat, into a fully fledged organized terror army. And the result of Israel's warfare is that it's no longer a terror army. They were organized like a veritable army, with battalions and divisions and whatever else they were called. Those units have been largely dismantled. However, that does not mean that there are no more military units remaining from them or any of their fighters. There are still Hamas fighters who remain relatively well armed. They also continue to possess a leadership structure, both militarily and politically, with some members in the Gaza Strip and others residing in luxury hotels in Qatar. And so the Israelis quite clearly know exactly who they need to engage with and negotiate with, because that continues to be the case. The talks never really stopped. At almost no point have the conversations completely ceased, even right now. So discussions are still ongoing, and yes, it's not exclusively about Islamic Jihad, which has been largely neutralized but hasn't been completely eradicated. They apparently still have hostages, as do Hamas members and parts of the so-called Palestinian civilian population. That's a point that absolutely needs to be reiterated time and time again. It wasn't solely these armed, organized groups who perpetrated this horrific massacre and subsequently took the hostages captive. Rather, significant portions of the so-called Palestinian civilian population were also involved, which is a crucial factor contributing to why the nature of Israel's military operations appears as it does today.
We'll take a brief interruption here, and following that, we'll delve into the historical background of what is commonly referred to as the Middle East conflict.
This is Mena-Watch, the independent Middle East think tank dedicated to providing you with crucial, in-depth analysis and information. Also be sure to visit our website. There you'll discover new daily reports and in-depth, scientifically grounded background analyses covering both the history and contemporary issues of the MENA region.